Hello, here today we have Christine Hallett, Professor of Nursing History at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom, Chair of the UK Association for the History of Nursing, and President of the European Association for the History of Nursing, if I'm not wrong.
No, you're right.
Christine is a trained nurse, holds PhDs both in nursing and history. So, Christine, can you tell us a bit, when did you start working on nursing history?
Oh, I started working on the history of nursing after I'd completed my PhD in history. The PhD was actually on the history of medicine. I was studying puerperal fever, childbed fever. So it really focused on obstetricians and midwives. But then once I'd completed that, and I was actually working in a school of nursing, somebody suggested to me, why are you working on medical history when you're a nurse? Because I already had a degree and a PhD in nursing. And that was what I was teaching. I was actually teaching nursing. But I had this PhD in medical history as well. And it seemed like a really good idea to start to look at history of nursing. So, because that was my own background. So I just very gradually got more into nursing. Obviously, you still stay under the umbrella of medicine, but I was moving a little bit away from medicine and more towards history of nursing. And then I got very interested in the beginning of the 20th century, because I thought the nursing that women were doing, they were all women at the time, professional nurses, I thought that the nursing they were doing was very broad-ranging and really interesting. And that got me into reading about the First World War.
Okay, so that was the second question. It's like, when did you start working on nursing during the First World War? It's been like 10 years maybe?
Yeah, I think I really first started seriously researching this subject around 2004, because I remember there was a lot in the news about it, by coincidence really. I don't think it was the media that really drew my attention to it, but as I was starting to read about the subject, it was the 90th anniversary of the First World War, of the outbreak of the First World War. So I started to see things about it in the news, television programs being made, and that kind of coincided with my research. And it took me 4 years to research my first book, and one of the jokes that I put in the preface to my book was that it had been as long as the war. My research for the book started in 2004, and I really completed it and wrote the book in 2008. And yes, I said, working on this has felt a bit like a battle, and it took as long as the war itself. And then the book was actually published by Manchester University Press in 2009. So, okay. We're going back a while now, a good 10 years ago.
Yes. So, you've mentioned that you wrote several books actually after this one on the work of nurses and during First World War. One, and maybe the most known, is Containing Trauma.
That's the one I was referring to.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, and I wanted nursing work in First World War, where you describe how nurses' work helped containing the trauma of patients, not only physically but also psychologically. But at the same time, some of these women, also voluntary nurses, not only professional nurses, also had to cope with their own physical and psychological traumas.
Yeah.
How can you tell us a bit how they managed to do it?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know a lot about how they managed that, their own trauma. There isn't very much in the historical record about what kind of support was given to them. So you really have to read between the lines of their own writings. You have to read their letters and their diaries. And then some of them were asked to write official narratives of their work. So that's interesting. Those are interesting sources to read as well. And I think it was by reading their own work that I got a sense of how they coped, or sometimes didn't always cope, with their own trauma. I think what they were doing was they didn't have any sense 100 years ago of the way we see things today. We see people who are coping with trauma as needing support and needing help. They just saw it as something you had to cope with on your own. And I guess a lot of what they did, we would see that as suppression or repression, but they saw it as handling their trauma and having what the British called the stiff upper lip. I don't know whether you've heard of that. Yes. That phrase, the stiff upper lip is a very Edwardian British thing where you don't let yourself break down. What you have to do is kind of hold yourself together. I think that's partly where I got this sense of containing, that they were containing themselves and they were containing the patients as well. So reading between the lines of them feeling that they had to cope like this, I got a sense that they did find ways to kind of let that trauma out a little bit, to release that trauma and express that in what we would judgmentally, I guess, see as a more healthy way. And I think they did it, they had support from each other. Yes. There was a camaraderie between the nurses, but they also wrote a lot. They used their writing a lot. They used their diaries to kind of release that trauma. So those sources are very interesting because they pour a lot of that trauma into their diaries.
Yes, for us it's very interesting because, as you know, the Portuguese nurses did not write that much. But you use a lot of sources, especially writings, letters, diaries. You even wrote a book on nurses, writers of the Great War, First World War. And do you have any idea of how many nurses' diaries you read through these years?
No. You could count. You could have a look in the bibliographies of my books, and you could do a count, but to be honest, I've never done that. It's dozens. There are so many of them. That's what's really great about this subject. It's a brilliant. I was lucky to find myself interested in a subject where there are a lot of really good sources, because there are probably hundreds. I'm saying dozens, but there are probably literally hundreds of sources of personal testimony if you look in archives right across the world, which I did. So in places like the Imperial War Museum in London, the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the Alexandra Turnbull Library in New Zealand, and the Library and Archives in Canada. If you start to trawl through all of those sources and many other archives, there are probably hundreds. So in some ways that's a great help when you want to write this sort of work, where you're tapping into the psyche, of the nurses themselves, and you're understanding what their experience was like. That's a great boon. But on the other hand, it's tricky as well, because you can find yourself a little bit overwhelmed by the sources, by the amount that these nurses have written.
Yes. And you mentioned yourself in one of your books that reading these diaries is a moving experience. There is a particular episode you want to share, or favorite diary or nurse?
I guess one that when I'm speaking to audiences about shell shock and the work the nurses did with the soldiers who were suffering from shell shock, there is a particular story that I like to use from a memoir that was written by a nurse called Helena da Silva. She was an American nurse, and she worked in a base hospital in northern France. And she tells the story of how she was supporting a very young patient who was about to go into surgery. I'm trying to remember, I think the injury was to his arm. He had a piece of shrapnel in his arm, and the shrapnel, what they found, one of the biggest problems they encountered was gangrene, anaerobic wound infections, and the worst and the most common was gangrene. And his arm had contracted one of these infections. His arm was going gangrenous, and they were looking to see what surgery they would do once they got him into theatre. And it was quite likely that they would just dig into the wound and remove remove the shrapnel, cut away all of the infected tissue, which they did quite extensively around these wounds, and then pack it or irrigate it and then bandage it, dress it. But there was also a possibility that they might actually amputate this arm. So she describes in very simple terms, it's almost like reading a novel, the way in which she has a conversation with this boy. She calls him a boy because he's about 18 years old. And she talks about how, as a nurse, she can have these very honest and simple and very supportive and quite maternal conversations with these young men that she calls boys. And it's quite, the way she expresses all of that, it really brings home, it really conveyed to me, and it does to audiences when I read this account, it really conveys how artistic the nurses' work was. They were using science and they were following orders from doctors and implementing treatments, but there was a great kind of artistry to their work as well, where they were just using their own intuition and they were thinking through what any particular individual patient's needs would be, and gaining an understanding of what was going on for a particular patient in a particular moment. Something you couldn't read up in a textbook or something you couldn't be trained to do. They learned from their experience to have this intuition. So Helen Boylston's book, Sister, The Diary of a War Nurse, is one of my favourites.
Okay. Yes, I think I remember.
It's in, I think I've mentioned that story in a couple of my books, actually.
And, first of all, nurses have somehow an iconic status. Do you think the centenary celebration changed somehow the image of nurses' work for better or worse, or no changes?
I think in Britain it brought the nurse back to public attention. At the beginning of the centenary in 2014, I hoped that it would rebalance the image of the nurse, because since the war, for 100 years, since the First World War, it had been the volunteer nurses, the VADs, who had had the most attention, because they'd written the most interesting memoirs in Britain. And I was hoping that my research and the research of other people might bring the trained nurses, the professional nurses, to the attention of the public more. People might gain more of a sense that nursing isn't just something you can put on a uniform and just do it like that you need training. It's a very professional role. Nurses train for 3 years, and there's a reason for that. So I was hoping that it would slightly rebalance that image, but I'm not sure it did. Because when it comes to public history and the public outputs, there was a television programme in the UK called The Crimson Field, but the very central characters in that were VADs. They were volunteer nurses. The trained nurses were very interesting, and they were quite impressive characters as well. So actually, maybe it went some way, towards rebalancing that image. But then the BBC also collaborated in a film version of Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, which was a very good film. It's a beautiful film, and I liked it, although it wasn't entirely accurate, but I did like it. Overall, I thought it was really good. But there we were back with the VAD. So the image we'd had of the nurses before the centenary, we ended the centenary with the same image, I think. Okay. But it brought nurses back into the attention, back to the attention of the public. So that was something. I was glad about that. I was pleased about that.
And may I ask, at the moment, what are you actually working on? You're still going to work on First World War nursing, or you're planning anything you want to share with us? Or
I'm finishing off some pieces of work that I started a few years ago when I was working on these books. Working on a paper looking at the way British and New Zealand nurses viewed patriotism, the extent to which they were patriotic, and they saw their work as a patriotic venture. And I'm also looking at nurse registration, the way in which nurses in the late 19th century and the early 20th century were engaged in a kind of battle to get recognition for their profession, to get the professional nursing register, which they did. get by Act of Parliament in December
1919.
Yeah, so I'm looking at those decades leading up to the First World War and during the First World War, and that kind of struggle to gain recognition for their profession and what that was been and the history of that.
And in a general way, what do you think can be the future developments and researches on the history of nursing? Mm-hmm. Not only your research, but maybe...
Yeah, another area that I'm really interested in is internationalism in nursing. Because again, that period 100 years ago was a time when there were a number of nurse leaders from different parts of the world, but especially probably the USA. There were leading nurses in the USA, in Germany and in Britain, but throughout the world really, who were coming together to form the International Council of Nurses.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And of course the ICN is still with us. But I think there was much greater sense at that time, this is just my assumption, but I think there was a greater sense that nursing was a global international discipline, and there was a greater knowledge exchange between nurse leaders and nurse educators at the time. So, I mean, I think that's a direction in which it would be really interesting to take nursing history, to look more closely in an international way, to collaborate more between nurse historians from different parts of the world, from different countries, to look at how at that time they were coming together and combining their ideas to create this kind of overarching image of what nursing was and what they believed nursing should be. So I guess that's a kind of intellectual history of nursing and nursing ideas. It would be interesting to look more closely at that and for us to do more collaborative work in that kind of area.
One final question. You teach nursing history, so in a way, what can you tell to nursing students, but also professionals, on the importance of history for their training and their working experience?
Well, this project that I'm just embarking on at the moment, looking at nurse registration, I'm looking at kind of rolling that out as a kind of public history project as well, so that as well as studying the history of the way in which the nurses gained their professional boundaries and their professional register and a national curriculum for nursing education, and looking at all of the problems and the dilemmas they encountered. One of the things I want to do is, as I mentioned, roll that out as a public history program so that we can take that to professional nurses who are already trained, who are doing leadership programs now, so that they can have a look at those examples from the past and look at the kind of problems that nurses were encountering and the kind of problems nurses were creating for themselves as well in the past, to see how maybe they could use those as examples, not in a simplistic way, but just gain a deeper understanding of how in any given time and place within a particular context you can find yourself with moral dilemmas, moral difficulties, extending beyond the boundaries of your practice, not practicing necessarily safely, and what as a nurse leader you can actually do about that, in order to kind of overcome those problems and create a safer profession that's also more caring.
Okay. Anything else you would like to add?
No, I don't think so. No, thank you. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk about my work. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for having a moment with us and to answer the questions. Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome. Thank you.